So it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Professor Samantha Frost. Sam Frost is a professor of political science at the University of Illinois' flagship campus at Urbana-Champaign, where she is also an affiliate professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies. Her PhD, also in political science, is from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Frost's research looks at the interactions between materiality, organic life, embodiment, and politics. This research has produced a number of major books and articles, starting with Lessons from a Materialist Thinker, Hobbesian Reflections on Ethics and Politics from Stanford in 2008, which was selected for a First Book Award from the Foundations of Political Theory section of the American Political Science Association. Frost then went on to co-edit with Diana Kuhl the influential volume New Materialisms, Ontology, Agency, and Politics, which came out from Duke in 2010, which calls on the humanities to increase our attention to materiality, embodiment, and the sciences, particularly the life sciences. She then received a New Directions Fellowship from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. This was amazing. I didn't even know these existed, but she received funding for a year to essentially retrain in biochemistry?
Molecular cell biology.
Molecular cell biology, close enough. Molecular cell biology, essentially on a sabbatical in order to pick up a new research field. She worked on this for a year and a half, taking courses in the sciences under the mentorship of Gene Robinson at the University of Illinois. And that led into her most recent book from 2016, also from Duke University Press, entitled Biocultural Creatures Towards a New Theory of the Human. This book reviews a range of findings from the natural sciences and programmatically considers their implications for various conversations within the humanities. Frost's latest research looks at the implications of epigenetic research for understanding politics. This morning's talk derives from this work entitled The Attentive Body, Epigenetics, the Index, and the Registers of Meaning. Please join me in welcoming Sam Frost.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And thank you also to Veronica for all the arrangements. I know that it's a lot of work to make those arrangements, so I appreciate your work on my behalf. Is this not working? Sorry. Let me just direct them to my shorter stature. So I have slides today. I am not a person who's very proficient in using PowerPoint because I'm a theorist and I generally just talk, but I am presenting a complicated argument today, and so my PowerPoint will not be very sophisticated. It will be like visual aids to help you understand what I'm saying and follow. So today I'm going to talk about meaning in relationship to the life sciences. I am not going to tell you that the life sciences can give us the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything, which we have pretty good reason to believe is the number 42. Rather, I'm going to talk with you about how recent findings in the science of epigenetics have the potential to transform our understanding of the way we make meaning, of how the world becomes meaningful for us. I will give an overview of what the science of epigenetics is. Then I will talk about the ways in which epigenetic processes in the living body, in your living body, evince a kind of molecular and cellular scale perception, memory, and intentionality. I will suggest that these molecular and cellular forms of perception, memory, and intentionality give us reason to think that the body is an attentive body, that it takes notice and responds. The body pays attention. Its living conditions are an object of that attention, and its attentiveness, its perception and meaning-making are the orienting conditions for its activities at the molecular and cellular level. There's something provocative and potentially generative in thinking about the body as attentive in this way. The attentive body does not have an unmediated relationship to the world. It interprets and finds meaning in it, meaning that both depends on and shapes habit, perception, experience, and anticipation. My sense is that the idea that the body is attentive, and therefore that we work with different registers of meaning, can provide a basis for linking together theories of culture, affect, and representation with research on urban and public space, on stress and precarity, and on the effects of the toxic and green environments on well-being. In other words, it can generate a fuller, richer sense of the meanings we find and make in the world. You see, it's just whatever. So epigenetics is a development in contemporary life sciences in which the body is conceived and treated as changeable and changing in fundamental ways through engagement with the lived world. Epigenetic approaches are used in a huge range of fields, for example, endocrinology, immunology, microbiology, neurology, and in being so used, they displace genes or the genome as the engine of development and growth. Epigenetics replaces the model in which genes are considered more or less determinative for health and behavior. Within an epigenetic framework, genes are not considered the beginning, the originator, or the initiator of gene activity. Instead, genes are considered to be one facet of a complex open bodily system. Because the body is considered to be a complex open system, the outside world comes in, literally and figuratively speaking. And when it comes in, the body responds. In and through that response, perhaps we could say in response to that response, the body produces biochemical markers that affect how the body will be rebuilt in the future, and thus how it will respond henceforth. So I'm going to explain this more slowly right now. Within an epigenetic framework, when the body responds to its persistence in a particular environment, it produces markers akin to Post-it notes that attach to various portions of the DNA to affect how the body composes and recomposes itself. The markers affect whether and to what extent the genes marked will be transcribed into RNA and then translated to make proteins. These markers are called epigenetic markers. Epi, because they are above or around the marked genes. And you can see these little pink things are some methylation molecules that are epigenetic markers in this diagram. And because they affect whether and how genes are used, we can think of them as akin to a note to self. To be ready next time, do this. To emphasize what is distinctive here, what is primary in the epigenetics framework is the response of the organism to its persistence in its habitat. For example, consider the case of people descended from those who were pregnant during the Dutch famine in World War II. These descendants have been found to have epigenetic markers on areas of their genome that affect metabolism. In this group, the epigenetic markers render their metabolism so very efficient that as a population they exhibit a tendency towards obesity. In other words, in experiencing a nutritionally deficient habitat, their bodies have produced epigenetic markers that enable them to be incredibly efficient about food absorption. Another example, a recent study found that mice who received negative stimulation paired with a specific noxious smell produced epigenetic markers appended around odorific genes. These epigenetic markers were passed on to offspring who were consequently particularly sensitized to the fearsomeness associated with that noxious smell, even without having any experience of the negative stimulation. The epigenetic processes generated in response to the initial priming prepared the mice and their offspring so that they were extra cautious, extra sensitive to dangers associated with that smell. These are just two examples, but the experiences to which bodies respond epigenetically are incredibly broad. They include the experience of taking in nutrition or not, absorbing toxins, enduring cold or heat, suffering violence, grieving loss of relations, and worrying about discrimination. Epigenetic processes are affected by material, social, and subjective or imagined experiences. All of these modes of experience can generate epigenetic markers that affect whether and when genes are used to make the proteins and other molecules that make our lives possible. There are several things I would like to draw out about the picture of the body that we get through epigenetics. First, the fact that epigenetic markers arise through the daily ongoing responses of an embodied person to his or her material and subjective experiences means that the biological body is responsive, plastic, and changeable. Scientists are currently exploring how social and material factors shape the composition and recomposition of biological bodies. As they do so, they are abandoning the notion that biological bodies are relatively closed off from their world, with their inner workings impervious to and protected from the environment, Instead, they find that genes, proteins, cells, and organisms are open to the environment and changing in various ways in response to it. And stupendously, the environment is construed not simply as chemical or material, but also as social, representational, symbolic, and imagined, including such phenomena as family dynamics, workplace inequalities, perceptions of social inequality, anticipated loss of a relationship, and the daily micro and macro politics of living in a gendered and racialized polity. So the body does not have integral boundaries. Its substance is not staid and stolid. Theoretically, then, we can no longer presume that the body is a stable substrate for cultural norms and modes of self-identification. We have to reconfigure our sense of how, for instance, material environment, culture, body work together in the constitution of a self. Second, this responsiveness and plasticity is not just superficial. There's responsiveness and plasticity all the way down, as we might say. What I mean is that genes, too, are responsive and plastic. Genes are not hard or constant, as Ernst Mayr has claimed. Such a view of genes as relatively unchanging primitive units of life, I'm using the terms there from Evelyn Fox Keller, as the material basis of life itself, as Donna Haraway puts it, has been at the heart of the differentiation of genes from the messy and variable flesh that engages the world. Epigenetics unravels this fable of the hard, sequestered gene. In this new paradigm, Donna Haraway explains, a gene is a node of durable action where many actors meet. Lappe and Landecker similarly desubstantialize genes, claiming that a genome is not a collection of things, but rather a metabolic process that is only stable because it is constantly stabilized, rewritten, copied, corrected, amended. As a metabolic process that is constantly rebuilding and restabilizing, the genome is transformed and redirected by the body's response to the provocations of living. In other words, as Evelyn Fox Keller suggests, the genome is, quote, an exquisitely sensitive and reactive system that responds to the constantly changing signals it receives from the environment. Third, because genes are nodes of biological activity rather than solid, nuggety things, the language of interaction that is often used to talk about the effects of the environment on gene activity, as in GXE or the gene and the environment interact, this language is mistaken. The language of interaction presumes an integrity to biological processes or to genes before the body comes into contact with culture or the environment. However, there is no before in which the genome is pure and untouched, such that it could then come into contact with and interact with an environment. Instead, there is constant engagement and modification in response to the environment over time. Another way to make this point is that the responsiveness of bodies to their environments is not just an expansion of the factors that provoke transformations in the biological functioning of bodies. More, as Guthman and Mansfield explain, this responsiveness is one through which bodies are active in their own remaking, a responsiveness through which environmental factors provoke transformations in the composition and recomposition of bodies, and the ways in which bodies produce and reproduce themselves on a daily basis, as well as across lifetimes and generations. Lappe and Landecker point out that, quote, time and context have come into the genome, such that the genome is now considered as having a varied temporal horizon, or, quote, a lifespan, within which changes in environmental provocations are registered at the level of chromatin. These temporally and contextually sensitive dimensions of the genome mean that biological processes do not pre-exist the environments in which they proceed and persist, but are constituted through responsiveness to those environments. Thus, Landecker says, it is not simply the case that the body responds to the environment, but rather that the environment provokes the making and remaking of the responsive body. In short, the responsiveness at issue in epigenetics is one in which a body's engagement with its environment provokes a response that not only changes how the body works, but also affects how or with what the body is made. In thinking with epigenetics, perhaps we should say that the body is not merely in its environment, rather it is of its environment. So fourth, at the same time that we have to give up the notion that genes are pure biological substance, the responsive plasticity I highlight today does not amount to an environmental reductionism. The reason is that there is a temporal disjuncture between what the body is prepared to do and the environment in which it is called upon to respond. When the environment comes into the body, as the scientists like to say, it does so not in the form of a deposit or a sedimentation. There's not a linear mechanistic reaction or cybernetic if-then conditional function, but the creature simply suffering the action effects of environmental inputs. Quite to the contrary, cells and the larger organisms of which they are composed respond to environmental provocation. And that response is one that prepares the creature for future such encounters via changing the processes of composition, decomposition, and recomposition. Indeed, Maloney and Testa suggest that the responsiveness of epigenetic processes means that the body is, quote, at once inhabited by traces of its past and seeded with traces of its future. These responsive and preparatory processes of composing and recomposing change or stabilize the cellular machinery and matrix that are the conditions of future environmental encounters and response. Because epigenetic processes prepare the body for the future based on past responses, based on the present made past, any response the body can generate will be slightly out of time with or off pace with the provocations and insults from its habitat, which is to say that an organism is non-contemporaneous with, and hence not reducible to, its contemporary habitat. Of course, as Maurizio Maloney points out, the recent scientific identification and elaboration of epigenetic processes is not the first time in history that the biological body has been considered permeable, changeable, and responsive to environmental provocations. However, the particular details of the molecular mechanisms is unprecedented, and it is on the implications of those details for our understanding of perception and meaning-making that I want to dwell today. Okay, so I'm interested in the fact that epigenetic processes prepare the cell and prepare the body for future encounters of the kind that provoked the epigenetic response. I am interested in the fact that such preparation gives an anticipatory temporality, a futural temporality, to the biological processes through which the body composes and recomposes itself. Thinking about that preparation, thinking about how that preparation rests on experiences of the lived world, I want to explore the possibility that epigenetic processes are perceptual, that they constitute a form of evaluation, memory, and anticipation. I want to explore the possibility that in their preparation of the body for future environments, in their marking and anticipation of salient features of future environments, epigenetic processes are part of the meaning-making processes by which creatures and humans in particular make their way through their worlds. I recognize that it sounds odd to talk about perception, memory, and anticipation in a cell at the molecular level, especially if the cell is not a neuron. Often in the scientific research on epigenetic processes, the language used to talk about these perceptive, anticipatory dimensions take the form of a simile. For instance, epigenetic processes are like perception, like memory, like anticipation. Given the way we generally categorize bodies and minds, or the way we distinguish biological processes and the meaning-making activities of thinking and feeling, we might ordinarily stutter if compelled to shift from a metaphorical claim to an ontological one. Epigenetic processes are a form of perception, are memory, are anticipation. However, that is precisely what I want to do today. Rather than ponder whether such similes are apt or dubious, I want to consider a different question. What would it take, theoretically or conceptually, for us to be able to affirm in a non-metaphorical way that epigenetic processes constitute a form of perception, memory, and anticipation, a form of meaning-making? So when people talk about the implications of epigenetics, they often focus on the way these processes compel us to call into question our understanding of the body and of the relationship between body and environment, or body and culture. My book, Biocultural Creatures, begins some of that work, and there's still a huge amount of work to do in tracing out those relations. But if we consider the conceptual dualisms that continue to organize our thinking, body-environment, body-culture, body-mind, matter-meaning, we can see that in addition to demanding that we rethink the categories that we use to think about the body, epigenetics also requires that we reconsider more abstract philosophical or theoretical concepts such as the nature of meaning, and bound up with this, the processes, agents, and location of perception. I suppose it should not come as too much of a surprise that epigenetics might also call on us to rethink our understanding of perception and meaning-making too. Many of our concepts, it seems, are up for reconsideration. What I want to think with you about today, then, is the possible form taken by this cellular or even molecular level perception and meaning-making. How is it possible to think or conceptualize this form of perception and meaning-making? For many scholars, the idea of meaning-making relies on the assumption that language or symbolic forms of representation are being used by culturally adept linguistic subjects. Or closer to what we aim at today, research who analyzes embodied forms of knowledge or extended cognition rely upon the workings of the distributed neurological system as the body moves through and acts in the world. However, the epigenetic processes we are considering today are not governed by linguistic agents, and they occur not just in neurons, but in all cells of the body. So in trying to conceptualize the epigenetic processes as perceptual and as generative of meaning, we are going to have to work through a non-linguistic, non-representational form of meaning-making that does not privilege the neurological system. To do this, I draw on the semiotic philosophy of Charles Sanders Peirce. So for Peirce, there are three kinds of basic signs: icons, symbols, and indices. An icon is a pictographic replication of an object of thought. The category of the icon includes, for instance, a pictographic representation of a sun to evoke in the addressee the idea of the sun, or for Peirce, an icon can be the mental percept picture, sun, that is evoked by the object, sun. There is a mimetic relationship between the icon and that to which it refers, a graphic fidelity between a sign and a referent, between an icon, an icon is a visual simile. And we could say that with the rise of emojis, our communication and interaction is increasingly iconographic. So whereas an icon has a mimetic relationship to its referent, a symbol has an arbitrary relationship to that to which it refers. For Peirce, a symbol is utterly conventional. In the Anglo-analytic tradition of thinking about language, a symbol has an agreed-upon relationship between it and its object. Think here of the English word hat, which has an arbitrary because conventional relationship to its object. We can appreciate its conventional relationship to its object because the word for that object changes in a different language. In French, for example, this word would be chapeau. In the tradition of continental linguistics, what is interesting about a linguistic sign or symbol is less the social or conventional nature of the relation between sign and referent, and more the systematic or not so systematic relations of differentiation between symbols and signs that constitute their meaning. What is important for our purposes today, I'm behind. Okay, that's fine. So what's important for our purposes today is that for Peirce, symbols enable us to describe and to denote, quite literally to represent. They also enable us to generate and communicate abstract thoughts or concepts. And lastly, there's the index, which is the kind of sign I'm particularly interested in today. What is an index? For Peirce, an index is a sign that indicates or points to a thing. It is gestural. An index can indicate, point, or gesture because of one of two possible characteristics. One, Peirce says, by virtue of a real connection with it, or two, because it forces the mind to attend to that object. So to take the first of these characteristics, an index indicates because of its physical proximity or material connection to the thing in question. For example, a wind vane is an index of the direction of the wind because its arrow is turned by the force of the wind upon it. A footprint is an index of a foot previously there because the weight of the passing foot made an impression. For some scholars, what is interesting about the index is this sense precisely that it is a corroboration of the existence of an object in the world, as Marianne Doan puts it. There is something real that generated the index. Because of the indicative nature of an index rests on a material intimacy or causal connection with the thing to which it points, an index is a non-arbitrary sign. This is also Kodja-Silverman's point. Unlike a great deal of linguistics, which deals with signs in the relations with one another, an index has a referent that is a real thing in time and space, an object in a specific context. To get to the second dimension of indexicality, Peirce claims that often indexical signs demand observational activity. That's his quote. They focus or direct the attention of the addressee to a specific object. Thus, signposts that point the way, a maritime map marking dangerous shoals, the prepositions this, that, and over there are indexical because they draw or direct the attention. Indexical signs can also take a pronomial form, whereby they indicate or gesture to the speaking subject. For example, the comment, "It's me," gains its meaning not as a truth claim with propositional content, but rather because it points to or evokes the person of the speaker. I can say that very smoothly, but that's actually a huge point of contention in philosophy of language, so we'll let that go. So there are several features of indexical signs that I'd like to draw out in somewhat more detail, because doing so will enable me to make the argument that epigenetic markers are indexical signs, signs that imply and entail a form of perception and meaning making at the cellular level. So first, what is distinctive in an index is its agency as an indicator. An index does not convey descriptive or propositional content. It is not denotative. Indeed, because its function is to gesture or to point, an index can be relatively contentless. It works primarily to draw attention to something, compelling its addressee to take notice. When what is designated or indicated by an index is the existence of the object with which the index has material or causal connection, it serves as a trace of prior contract or action, as a mark of history, or, as Marianne Doan puts it, a witness of an anteriority. And when what is indicated by the index is something to which the addressee should give attention, then Peirce explains, it may take the form of more or less detailed directions for what the hearer is to do to place himself in direct experiential or other connection with the thing meant. That was his long quote. So, unlike an icon, an index is not judged according to its approximation of or fidelity to the real. And because an index is not representational in the way that a symbol is, its meaning is not dependent on its relationship to a conceptual, logical, or representational system. An index can be said to have worked, not through an assessment of the veridicality of its content, but rather through its success in provoking and directing the attention of its addressee towards its object. Second, the effectiveness or indicative work of an index depends upon the addressee's current or prior experience with the context within which the object is to be found, or the addressee's familiarity with the object itself. So an index does not describe an object in general. It does not describe an idea of an object, as a symbol might, but instead draws attention to a specific object. Thus, part of the job of the index is to give spatial and temporal specification to that specific object to which it refers. For example, an index would not describe the general idea of water hazards, not there are rocks in the waterways. Rather, an index specifies a particular hazard in a particular locale. Beware the submerged rock just after the first curve in the estuary of the River Yelm. So Peirce claims that, quote, in order to identify an object, we generally state its place at a stated time, and in every case must show how an experience of it can be connected with the previous experience of its hearer. So an index conveys to someone information about a particular object. In order to focus the attention of the addressee, in order to direct it, the temporal and spatial context for the index must accord with or be connected with the hearer's experience. For Peirce, then, because an index refers to a specific object, this button, that house, an index depends upon a particular context for its sense or meaning, a context relative to the addressee, a context with which the addressee needs familiarity in some form or another in order to be able to direct his or her attention appropriately. Third, in directing attention, an index often provokes its addressee to notice not a thing qua thing, nor a person qua person, but rather the relation between the addressee and the thing or person. In other words, an index points to a situation. In explaining this, Peirce notes, quote, "When a driver, to attract the attention of a foot passenger and cause him to save himself, calls out, 'Hi!' So far as it is simply intended to act upon the hearer's nervous system and rouse him to get out of the way, it is an index, because it is meant to put him in a real connection with the object, which his situation relative to the approaching horse." Notice here that the object with which the addressee is put into connection is not the horse, but the situation relative to the horse. The driver yelling "hi" is not casting a greeting or inviting the addressee to greet the horse, but rather is drawing attention to the situation of the addressee, which is the fast horse and carriage in whose path the addressee stands. The index here says, "Look out," and implied in this directive to attend to the situation of being in the path of the horse and carriage is the presumption that the addressee would then act to avoid the impending collision. So fourth, an index implies the prospect of action. An index that says, "Watch out, beware, or go this way," not only draws the attention of the addressee, but prompts an appropriate response. "It's me," for instance, not only evokes or points to the person of the speaker, not only relies on the familiarity of a prior encounter, but also implies expectation of action, i.e., "It's me, so please let me in." It is in view of this anticipation of action that I would like to say that an index is intentional, not simply in the broad philosophical sense of being about a specific something, although it is that, but also in the more precise sense articulated by Elizabeth Anscombe, for whom intentionality involves practical knowledge. Anscombe writes that, quote, "Intentional action always presupposes what might be called knowing one's way about, and this knowledge is exercised in the action," unquote. The intentionality of an index, then, lies in its prevailing upon its addressee to notice and orient him or herself towards a situation so as to be able to get about in it. To sum up, then, an index draws attention, is contextually and experientially specific, points to the relation between the addressee and its object or the situation, and has intentionality in ways that links it to practical knowledge. All of these features are helpful in thinking about the meaning-making that is bound up with epigenetic processes. For as I shall explain in more detail now, epigenetic processes register and orient the body to its lived environment. They mark and render meaningful and actionable the relation between the body and its situation. I have a but. So, this is the but. Before moving on to explain how epigenetic processes can be seen as indexical, I should note a possible objection. The objection turns on two things. First, the fact that many of the examples of indices that I have given rely on the presumption of the sensory nervous system. And second, the fact that many indices, indeed many of the examples I gave of indexicality, take a linguistic form. Watch out, over there, it's me. In other words, it seems that indices presume human agents interacting with one another in a social fora. In wanting to talk about epigenetic processes, which involve non-linguistic biochemical molecules and cells in living bodies, and wanting to talk about epigenetic processes as indexical, perhaps I'm doing nothing more than slyly recommitting myself to metaphor by way of anthropomorphism. But I would suggest that I am not. So Marianne Doan claims that the ways that an index performs depends upon the medium in which the index is made. This dependence of the index upon its medium is what she calls medium specificity. As a concept, medium specificity draws our attention to the material substance which harbors both constraints and possibilities for something to leave a trace. For example, the sensitivity to light of paper coated with silver nitrate constrains and makes possible the variegated trace of light and shadow in a photograph. The moisture and density of sand particles delimit and create the possibilities for leaving a footprint. The achievement and recognition of a certain kind of subjectivity constrains and makes possible linguistic self-referentiality. The possibility and form of the photograph, the footprint, or the pronoun or preposition are specific to the media of photographic paper, damp sand, and linguistic subject. So if we are to talk about the indexicality of epigenetic processes, we must consider the specificity of the medium in which those epigenetic processes occur, which is to say that we must consider the specificity of the medium that is the living body. 26. The living body is not just a collection of physical chemical reactions akin to the photographic paper, nor a mere aggregation of cells akin to a patch of wet sand. It is not a passive physical object that blindly and mutely receives the imprints or impressions of objects in the external world with which it collides. Georges Canguilhem observes, quote, "To act on a living being, a physical excitation has not only to occur, but also to be noticed," unquote. This idea that a living body doesn't just receive, but also notices a physical excitation is fascinating. Canguilhem explains that such noticing is not a linear series of mechanistic cause and effect, not, quote, "a sum of distinct molecular reactions to a stimulant that can be divided into units of excitation." Instead, he claims the animal reacts as a whole. Philosopher Samuel Todd similarly argues that rather than passively receiving perceptual inputs, a living body moves through its world with what he calls poised responsiveness, with poise here meaning a certain readiness to meet an expectation, a capacity to prepare or brace ourselves to meet what is coming, unquote. So a living body is a complex emergent phenomenon that actively engages with and prepares itself to engage with its lived world. As I have just explained regarding epigenetic processes, a living body responds to the constant inflow and outflow of matter, energy, and percepts by adjusting the forms and frequencies of its activities of composing and decomposing. These adjustments take place through the generation and placement of epigenetic markers that influence whether and the extent to which particular genes are accessed and used by the body to produce the proteins it needs to keep going. It is precisely in view of the ways that epigenetic processes adjust the forms and frequencies of the body's activities of composing and decomposing that I want to say that epigenetic markers... Did I skip a page? No, oh shit. 17, 18. Oh, my back pages, I think I might have skipped a page. No, I didn't. 15, 16. This is supposed to be 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Just a few more, just a little bit to go. Sorry, my pages got mixed up in the travel. Okay, now we're here. So it is precisely in view of the ways that the epigenetic processes adjust the forms and frequencies of the body's activities of composing and decomposing that I want to say that epigenetic markers are indexical. Because a living body takes notice, is responsive to its own responsiveness, is poised, we can say the following about its medium specificity. For a living body, epigenetic processes are indexical both as trace and indicator. Epigenetic markers take the form of index as trace because they are linked materially or causally to the body's history and experience, to the body's past. Epigenetic markers also take the form of index as deixis, which is the referential gesture, the pointing finger or the this of language. By way of the response conceived as trace, epigenetic markers point to the world and to what it demands of the body. So granting that it might be possible to speak of indexicality in epigenetic processes that is specific to the medium of the living bodies in which they are produced, we can elaborate more fully the characteristics of that indexicality. So the following points map onto the 4 insights about indices that I drew out of Peirce's work and some of his readers. So first, the function of an epigenetic marker is primarily indicative, as a trace, as an indicator of a specific response to a particular kind of experience. An epigenetic marker gestures towards or draws attention to the body's experience of its habitat. An epigenetic marker does not resemble the response to the experience that produced it, which is to say it's not iconic. Nor does an epigenetic marker describe, denote, or represent the response to experience that produced it, which is to say that it's not symbolic. There are just a handful of epigenetic markers found and examined by researchers so far, and each kind is a tiny mote, a minute molecule. If an epigenetic marker is a methyl group, it's 4 atoms big. If it's an acetyl group, it's 6 atoms big. A phosphate group, it's 5 atoms big. You get the picture, small and spare. In fact, we could say that they are contentless, much in the way that indices or indexes are contentless. Epigenetic markers indicate, and they perform their indicative function by their placement on strings of DNA. Much as an arrow gains its meaning from a particular location in context, if it's placed here, an arrow means one thing. If it's placed there, an arrow means another. So an epigenetic marker does its work by virtue of its particular placement on a string of DNA. It is in its placement near this or that gene that an epigenetic marker indicates the body's past response to an experience and redirects the production of the functional proteins that make that body work. Second, as molecules produced and placed through the body's responsiveness, epigenetic markers are traces of that body's experience. They are generated through and thus causally connected with the history of the body's responses to its lived world. As far as scientists seem to know, epigenetic markers are not randomly or spontaneously produced. Rather, they are linked to particular experiences of a living body moving through particular material and social contexts. Such experience can be toxic, nutritive, stressful, ill, depressed, anxious, happy, or angry. It can be remembered, anticipated, or imagined. It can be traumatically intense, or the long grind. It can be consciously or unconsciously experienced, or experienced by prior generations. The ability of epigenetic markers to function as a trace or indicator, their ability to direct, redirect, and adjust varied uses of different genes, depends not upon a change in their constitution, but upon the cellular and genetic context in which they append themselves. It depends upon the cellular and genetic context. Without that context, without appending to a string of DNA, an epigenetic marker would not indicate anything. It would just be a micromolecule floating around. Third, epigenetic markers function to alert a body to its situation. In their specific placement on strings of DNA or on the proteins that package DNA, they indicate what the body has lived through and how it needs to adjust its processes of composition and recomposition so that it can persist into the future. So again, epigenetic markers are not deposits. They are not mere effects of a linear causal force. Rather, they are generated in variously precise response to the body's engagement with its world. They indicate not just the world itself, nor just the workings of the body. Rather, they serve as a trace or indicator of the response of the body in its relation to the world, which is to say, that they serve as a trace or indicator of the response of the body to its situation. And remarkably, in being indicative of that response, they are also at the same time directive. They make possible or impossible the processes of composition and recomposition by which the body persists in living. Epigenetic markers draw the body's attention to its situation in its lived world and point to a course of composing and recomposing action that will enable the body to persist in it. So fourth, epigenetic markers are intentional, both in the sense that they are about the body's response to its experiences and in the sense that they concern prospective action. Harkening back to Elizabeth Anscombe's definition of intentionality, we can say that in their indexicality, epigenetic markers constitute a form of practical knowledge that enables the living body to, quote, know how to get about in its situation. When a living body responds to its current habitat by generating and placing epigenetic markers, it is thereby adjusting its activities of composing and recomposing. Hannah Landecker notes that epigenetic processes, quote, set the template for the future in the sense that they prepare the living body to respond well to similar future habitats. A body's epigenetic adjustment of the activities of composing and recomposing is anticipatory, a carrying forward of current responses in preparation for future responses. So epigenetic markers are preparatory, indicating how the body should be rebuilt or recomposed so as to be ready and able to deal with the provocation the next time around. In being anticipatory and preparatory, epigenetic markers work within an implied temporal horizon. Epigenetic processes proceed with a functional presumption that there will be a repetition in experience or habit, a repetition for which the body must be prepared. Unlike the fight or flight instincts, epigenetic processes do not presume to change the situation in which the body finds itself. Rather, epigenetic processes prepare the body to adjust to the situation so as to survive in it. It is because of this combination of response to present become past, and because of anticipatory directive, that I want to say that epigenetic processes are intentional. Epigenetic markers are about a body's response to its world. They tag DNA in such a way as to ensure that specific genes are used or not used in specific ways, so that the body can persist in its next encounter with the provocation that elicited the response. In tagging genes so as to prepare the body for its future persistence, epigenetic markers orient the body in relation to its projected situation in the world, directing, I want to say, its attention to what must be done in order to persist in its living processes. So epigenetic markers are intentional then because they serve as an orientation to practical action. So the body perceives, the body pays attention, the body makes meaning of its world. We are not just living flesh, and we are not just subjects of language and culture. If the body pays attention at molecular and cellular level, if it perceives and generates meaning and adjusts the body's form and manifold workings in accordance with those meanings, then neither the body, culture, nor the environment can be secondary or supplementary to any analysis of subjectivity, affect, personhood, or self. As we move through the world, we produce and experience many registers of meaning: linguistic and symbolic, psychological, neurological, and affective, and molecular and cellular in the form of epigenetic processes. If the ways that bodies are built and rebuilt condition how we are able to respond to our world, to our experience, and to our situation, then any more than superficial analysis of culture, society, economics, or politics will need to take into account what our bodies have made of our inheritance and what we could or should do deliberately or collectively to build to our built, natural, social, and symbolic environments to make the world a more suitable place in which to live. Likewise, any normative project concerned with articulating or justifying how we might live or developing criteria according to which we choose how to live collectively together will have to come to terms with the multidimensionality of the experiences that matter to us and the moderating effects that they have upon one another. And finally, even though epigenetic processes accommodate the body to extant and expected conditions and circumstances, in our awareness of them, we can work deliberately, consciously, and together to transform those conditions and circumstances in accordance with our assessment of the good, the right, and the just way to organize a collective existence. The science of epigenetics has been deployed already to serve neoliberal biopolitical ends, but is not doomed or destined to do so. The argument I have laid out before you today suggests that the idea that the body is attentive gives us the conceptual resources to trace connections between ideas about identity, social and power relations, aesthetics, faith, poverty, war, toxins, nutrition, and climate. To trace connections so as to develop plans for transforming our lived environments so that all creatures, great and small, can live well. Thank you.